probably don't need it, but where BCAT is recording this, we need to use the mic just to get the audio. My name's Joe Adebato. I'm the Director of Counseling here at Burlington High School. Thank you for coming tonight. As you know, the college process can be overwhelming, takes a lot of time, so we try to really provide opportunities like this to make sure parents still feel and should be connected and in the loop, especially with financial aid. It's a process that you hear a lot about, but I think actually hearing from the experts is definitely a benefit to you as parents and student that's here tonight. But we're very, very fortunate in that we've been working with Amy's staff here now for 6 or 7 years. She's been coming out speaking to Burlington parents for, like I said, for a number of years. Very informative. I'll let her introduce her role and where she works. But again, we are very lucky to have her. You'll hear a little bit about the organization she's part of called MIFA. It's a nonprofit in Massachusetts that offers lots of free resources. And I really encourage parents to really take advantage of that opportunity. And again, you'll hear more about MIFA throughout the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Amy.
Perfect, thank you. So let's jump in. So MIFA is a not-for-profit state authority here in Massachusetts. They're a wonderful resource. I have been volunteering on behalf of them for, oh boy, I think 26 years, which seems insane to me, but, and I do that because I believe in them and what they provide. They provide a lot for our counselors in the state of Massachusetts with training. They provide a lot of training opportunities for families as well with things like the admission process, the financial aid process, and they utilize volunteers like myself who work, you know, in the profession, you know, that I'm speaking on. So I have, just to give you a sense of me, I have been doing financial aid for about 27 plus years because I started, it was supposed to be a one-day filing job at the financial aid office at Harvard University. I spent 21 years actually working full-time and once graduating college in that office, and then I have been at Simmons University as the Assistant Vice President of Enrollment, Student Services, and Director of Financial Aid. There I'm just going into my 7th year. And so this is what I do day in and day out. And as was noted, it can be a lot of information, even if you're going through it for the second time. And I'm sure many of you have heard the fun that we've had to go through with the FAFSA form, the federal form, this past year. It was really challenging for some people, really challenging for administrators as well, because you'll hear me talk about the fact that things were supposed to open at a certain time and they did not. They were very delayed. We're hoping that next year's process kind of goes back to normal, but I have heard slight rumblings that it might be a little bit late, but my hope is that everything kind of goes back to normal. There's a lot of pressure being put on the Department of Education to kind of get things right and do that quickly. So tonight we're going to talk about the types and sources of financial aid. We'll talk about the application process. There is that FAFSA form, but there may be other forms that a student needs to complete. Things that you'll hear me say throughout the presentation, it depends. That's because each school is different, so it might be that that school requires additional forms, or a school may have a certain process of how they award their own funds as opposed to, you know, the awarding of federal funds. So I will try to provide examples throughout the presentation based on my experience at a variety of schools. We'll talk about how financial aid decisions are made, and then we'll see how everyone's doing when we get to kind of paying for college. You know, it's a lot of information. I think it's actually great. Usually these presentations are done in the fall, and it's really jammed together with you know, the admission presentations. The whole process has kind of gotten stuffed into that fall term. But some of the stuff that I'll talk about is really great at this point because I assume your children are just ending their junior year. and going into that senior year. So this is that summer where you kind of ramp up looking at schools. And so you can start that process of looking at some financial aid information. I'll talk about the resources and how to do that for each of the schools. So it's really kind of good to do this now. And you know, Joe asked me to do this a couple years ago to try and do a junior presentation, and I think it's great, but most of the other schools, we still do them in the fall. So what exactly is financial aid? It is money to help a student, you know, pay for college, and it really is categorized into 3 buckets. We have grants and scholarships, which is free money, does not need to be repaid. We have loans, student loans, so that's money a student borrows, or perhaps a parent is borrowing, and then that has to be repaid at a later date, or possibly not, depending on the government, right, with loan forgiveness. And then we have something called federal work study, and that is something that I always have questions about, you know, as people are receiving information that, oh, they've been awarded this work study, what exactly is it? It's a pot of money that actually comes from the federal government, and it's given to institutions. And then the institution awards that money to a student, and it's really that the student then has to get a job, and they can earn those dollars through an on-campus job or possibly off-campus. And so that's what that is and what those dollars represent. I hate this slide here in the presentation because for me, I feel like I haven't talked about a lot of concepts that I would like to discuss before talking about student loans, but I was outvoted by the other volunteers because they say that they get questions about loans right in the beginning. So, here, this is just about the federal student loan, so what a student can borrow through the federal government. And what you can see here is that there are limits that a student can borrow from the federal government through completing the FAFSA form. So as a first-year student, the maximum that they can borrow through the federal loan program is $5,500. It goes to $6,500 as a second-year student, and then $7,500 for third and fourth year. The student is the sole borrower. There's no credit check, so the student just has to be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, not in default on any student loans. Well, as a first-year student, there's no way you could be in default on a federal student loan, but those are the real kind of basic things that a student, in order to be able to access this loan funding. Right here, this subsidized and unsubsidized. And this is where there's concepts I haven't talked about, but if a student has need or financial aid eligibility, which we'll get to that slide later, they can be eligible for up to $3,500, $4,500, and $5,500 as a subsidized loan, meaning that the loan, the interest is actually being paid by the government, so it's not accruing any interest. Right? So if a student borrowed the $3,500 here as subsidized, and then they get to their senior year, they've been enrolled at least half-time, all of that time, and they go into repayment another 6 months after graduation, that loan would still be $3,500, no interest accrues. So that's wonderful. Back, I don't know, maybe could be 17 years ago, there was a push to kind of increase loan limits, and so the government said, okay, we'll increase them by $2,000, but even if a student has eligibility, it's an unsubsidized loan. So if you're eligible for the subsidized, you're going to see a second loan on there, federal direct loan unsubsidized, and would be $2,000. Unsubsidized means the interest is accruing from the time it is dispersed. And it will accrue interest. It can be paid quarterly, or it can be capitalized, and it gets added onto the loan at the point of going into repayment. And students always have the choice of what they want to borrow, right? So what you're presented from a school with their total financial aid package is, this is what you're being offered. and you have the opportunity to accept or decline any of the funding. It's a little bit depressing. The interest rates have been going up, and we just found out for the 24-25 year that the undergraduate loan is going to 6.53. All of the loans, undergrad, grad, and the Parent Plus loans jumped like 1% from last year's rate, and they've been going up, but it's based on a T-bill plus either 2 or 3% depending on the level, undergrad or grad. And on the flip side for investing, like T-bill rates have gone up, but that means that these interest rates are going up. It's a fixed, so one thing that I would say is it's a fixed interest rate for the life of the loan for that borrowed in that year, but every year there's a new interest rate for the new year in borrowing. The government does have something called consolidation. So let's say that interest rates actually start to go down and a student has borrowed in their 4th year at a lower interest rate, maybe in their 3rd year. You can consolidate the loans and it becomes a weighted average of all of those interest rates. So perhaps there's an opportunity to get a little bit of a lower interest rate. As far as repayment is concerned, typically, a student goes into repayment 6 months after they graduate. I only say typically because if the student takes a leave, withdraws, or drops below half-time enrollment for greater than 6 months, they're going to go into repayment on the loan. And then if a student borrowed these maximums, it's about $27,000. Which is about a $300 monthly payment for 10 years. You can pay off, the entire loan prior to 10 years. You can pay more than your monthly payment when in repayment, and there's no penalties or fees for doing so. But one thing that I think is really important is noting this and noting these limits because there's a lot out there in the news around crushing loan debt and that students cannot kind of make it through in life because of crushing loan debt. And it's not undergraduate federal loans that are causing that. And that's something that I often talk about when trying to make a school work, right, and borrowing private loans, or oftentimes at the graduate level, there's less in kind of grant and scholarship funding, and sometimes students are borrowing and then borrowing for living expenses and things like that, and that's where it can kind of add up quickly and become untenable. So I do just like to point out these things. So where does the financial aid come from? We have a couple of different sources here. We have the federal government, all right, and that would be grants. The Pell Grant, the federal Pell Grant, is the kind of one federal grant. You may have heard about that in the news with all of the FAFSA changes. One of the things that they were trying to do was actually increase eligibility, and so we're seeing at institutions anywhere up to about a 30% increase in the students that are eligible for a Pell Grant. What I would also point out is that for the lowest income family, so the maximum Pell Grant, because it's based on need, is $7,395 this year. For actually this year and the coming year. So your child will be 25, 26. It may go up, but usually it's increments that are, it's not going to all of a sudden jump to $10,000, like in that year. It will probably still be in the 7,000, under 8,000 range. The work study also comes from the federal government, and then the loans. And then MIFA kind of puts this in here about tax incentives. I don't always see that as financial aid, but for any, the money that you pay toward tuition, there's a tax credit of up to $2,000. So something to be mindful of. In the state of Massachusetts, if a student is a Massachusetts resident and attending a Massachusetts school, they may be eligible for funding through the state. The state has the Massachusetts State Grant, which is very similar to the federal Pell Grant, although their maximum is $3,000. But if a student is eligible for the maximum Pell, they're typically going to be eligible for that maximum Massachusetts State Grant. There's not a separate application that needs to be completed. By completing that federal FAFSA form and the student noting the state that they live in, their state of residence, the state ends up getting that information. What I would note is there have been some significant increases on the state side of things where, in fact, we've actually been pretty low as far as state funding for higher education for students for many years. But this past year, there has been an influx of dollars, most of it for the public institutions. But for students who are not U.S. citizens, whether they are DACA students or undocumented, as long as they've been in a Massachusetts school for at least 3 years, they're now eligible for Massachusetts state funding. They would have to use the Massachusetts created a form called the MASFA, and they're also eligible for in-state tuition. So just want to point that out. That's a significant change that has happened. There are some scholarships. Most scholarship and tuition waivers, again, are for public institutions in the state. And then loans, it's a really, really small pot of money that I almost don't even like to talk about it because you're not likely to see it in many financial aid offers that you receive at institutions. At Simmons, we don't have an allocation. When I was at Harvard, we had an allocation of $30,000 that we could use. It's a no-interest loan program, but that's hard to spread across all, Massachusetts residents within certain income levels. And then colleges and universities. So when I point out $7,395 as a maximum and $3,000 here as a maximum, and when you're looking at, say, a private institution where the costs are a bit higher, a significant dollars are coming from institutions, right, in the form of either grants or scholarships, which, again, free money. Again, with this loan and putting loan here, you might see a loan at an institution. It's not typical. Again, my experience at Harvard, we had a pretty hefty loan program that we utilized for students. At Simmons, I have a very small one that I use in more like emergency situations. So it's not something that I would be, out offering for a first-year student. And then, of course, other agencies, we call these outside scholarships, private scholarships. I really try and point students to and families to the high school. Oftentimes there's information around those scholarships. I know that when I do the presentation in the fall, they'll talk about that and give information around that, because oftentimes it's those local scholarships that we see students coming in with. There are also more national scholarships, and there are scholarship databases, things like MIFA Pathway, FastWeb, Big Future through the College Board, that students can certainly apply for scholarships that way. The only thing that I would say is it takes work and effort, and they say applying for 10 at least to net one scholarship. So it can be work. But I will answer the question that often gets asked, like, is it worth the work, right, to apply for all of those scholarships? So when we look at some sample financial aid packages, I'll answer that question. Oh, I think my battery might have died. yeah, it's not, it doesn't charge. I need a new battery. I think it was left on, so that's my own fault. All right, so the next two slides are just to give a sense of how aid is awarded, right? It's either going to be based on merit, so there's some reason that the student is being given, and typically when we use the word scholarship, that's often, it's a merit-based. There's some reason they're giving it, whether it's academic, athletic, you know, the student's a super tuba player and the school needs a tuba player in their band. There's some reason that the student is getting that award, that scholarship. It may or may not be renewable. I would say a large majority of merit scholarships are renewable, but there might be certain criteria that needs to be met. So if it's you know, an academic scholarship, the student may need to maintain a certain GPA. If it's an athletic scholarship, they would likely have to remain on the team that had recruited them. It should be clearly stated in any communication that the student gets. Usually, oftentimes, it's from the admission office. And so within the letter, it would detail out, you know, must maintain X GPA, right, in order to retain this from year to year, or perhaps it's continuous enrollment. Merit scholarships aren't offered at every school, but there's, you know, a significant number of schools that do offer merit scholarships, typically private, you know, institutions. One thing that I always point out is that it is very, very important, and you know, through the summer, it's a great thing that you can kind of task your child with, is to start to look at some of the websites of the institutions that they may be interested in. Look at the admission website, look at the financial aid website. Because when I first started at Simmons, there was a student who came into the office to meet with me, and she was a second-year student. And she said, you know, is there any way that I can apply for this Kotson scholarship, which was a full tuition scholarship, room and board, and there was a stipend for research of about $3,000. And she said, I didn't know about it when I was applying to the university. And unfortunately, that is only for students applying into the university. That has a very early deadline, and there's additional things that need to happen. The reason for me to tell that story is I don't want to have someone say, I didn't know that something existed, that an opportunity existed. So, for instance, at our school, we assess all students for merit scholarships just through the admission process, right, with their admission application, but we have these two outliers that require additional information in an application. So just look at information, or task your child with looking at information and making notes and knowing what might be available to them. So the other way that aid is awarded is based on need, and so that's looking at income and asset information of the family, and the FAFSA form and asks for that information, as well as additional forms that may be required. We use this kind of financial aid eligibility, which I talked about with the loans, and sometimes it's referred to as need. It's really the difference between what the cost of the school is and what's determined as through the FAFSA form, that kind of a family, their kind of financial strength, what they can afford for that year of college. The second bullet point, eligibility determined by a standardized formula. For the federal funding, it is a standard formula, but when you start to talk about institutional dollars and possibly using different forms, right, that can vary a little bit. But most institutions, or all institutions, are using some sort of formula that very much mimics that federal formula to determine what a student's eligibility is. It would include any grants Loans and work studies, so as long as a student has need, they're eligible for that subsidized portion of a loan. And that's where eligibility for work study comes into play as well. And when we look at cost of attendance and the formula, I can kind of point that out. The last bullet point is about making satisfactory academic progress. The federal government is my best friend. They love to put rules and regulations on us and change those rules and regulations often, which is fun. But one of the things that they require us to monitor is that students are basically progressing in their degree toward graduation. And so, and you can lose your financial aid if you're not progressing in a kind of satisfactory way. So it's done in two ways. It looks at GPA. So a student has to at least be at a 2.0 by the end of sophomore year. Some institutions will just use the 2.0 right from the beginning as first-year students. And then additionally, it looks at what's called PACE. So to ensure that students really aren't needlessly racking up loans, but not completing and really progressing toward their degree in a good way. So PACE is how many credits did the student attempt versus how many did they actually complete. And one story I'll note with this is that and actually, this also goes on the merit scholarship, so I will align the two. I'm sure that you've seen within, you know, your friend groups, just an increase in mental health challenges among some of our students and young people. Heck, some of our adults as well. I've seen instances, and I saw something even in the pandemic, where students started in that first term and then halfway through the term had to withdraw and take a leave of absence, right, for reasons to be able to get themselves into a better place and come back and be successful. Well, for that student, they're automatically at a 0 PACE, and the bar for satisfactory academic progress is 67%, right? So just know that there's an appeal process that every institution has to have. That's part of the federal regulation as well. So, and my other note is, I have put into place, seeing some of these challenges, a policy for reinstatement of a merit scholarship. So a student who, you know, didn't quite meet the GPA or had to take a leave of absence, had some sort of, you know, mental or physical challenge. I'm not saying that every institution has that, but what I like to put out there is ask questions, because the worst that they can say is no, right? But the best that they could say to you is, yeah, you know what, we have this form, we have this process, or perhaps even if they don't, yeah, we're willing to work with you, because that's a tough thing to kind of go through. So that's my story on satisfactory progress and merit scholarships. All right, so the application, the timeline, and hopefully we go back, because the FAFSA normally opens October 1st. And this year it opened on December 31st because of delays and changes to the FAFSA form. And then it got further complicated by not releasing the output of that data to schools until mid-March. And so that really crunched for students and families the decision-making process and having full information to be able to make a decision. So that was tough. But in theory, everything should go back to opening October 1st and being able to complete forms early and start to get information. Early action and early decision deadlines are often early, like in October, November timeframe, and then kind of regular action, maybe February or March. Very important, you can see that it's in all caps and underlined, to meet deadlines. I've been thankful to work at 2 institutions where if a student misses the deadline, we will still accept their application and still assess them just as if they had met the deadline. Over the years, I have been in meetings with colleagues from other institutions where maybe funding is limited, and missing that deadline means the student might miss out on funding, or perhaps it's a lesser amount. So I always, even though my experience has been, we're still going to award a student or package a student with just as if they met the deadline. I always just highlight meet those deadlines because it could really matter. Each institution will have their own deadlines, so I would suggest another thing as you're looking at schools and then adding a school that's possibly on the list. Once the student kind of decides exactly what that list is, you're going to want to have the name of the institution, what their admission deadline is, what their financial aid deadline is, and then, as we'll talk about, what forms does this institution require as well. So I'm a checklist person, so that's how I see that working. So the FAFSA form, the free application for federal student aid, this is the form that in applying for financial aid, everyone is going to have to fill this form out, right? And in theory, it's easier to fill out than in the past, but there are some pockets of students that really had some trouble in completing it because of changes they've made to the form. And it does need to be completed each year. Some demographic info will kind of roll from year to year, but kind of connecting up with the IRS information is part of what needs to be updated. Available on FAFSA.gov as of October 1st, hopefully. It's going to be the 25-26 FAFSA form. You can see on that little picture, the 24-25 FAFSA, and then there's still the opportunity to complete the 23-24 one. The 25-26 will not become available until October 1st. So you cannot complete it. I've been at a presentation, someone said, oh, I completed one already, and it's like, nope, that goes for a separate year, so you're going to have to go back and complete it when that year's one opens. One thing you can do is get what's called an FSA ID. The student needs an FSA ID, Federal Student Aid ID, and a parent needs an FSA ID. And that is your information to go in and begin to complete the FAFSA as well as to sign the FAFSA form. And I think there's another slide where I'll go into a little more depth on that. Some of the changes, now has anyone completed a FAFSA form previously and last year or previous? Okay, so for everyone else, there's no changes, but for someone who's completed it before, it will look a little bit different. It used to be kind of one form, right, that the student goes in and starts it, and then parents, go in and they're completing their section, but they can see everything. Now, the student goes in and they invite a contributor or contributors, and then that, and usually that's a parent, they're going in and just completing a section about themselves. They don't see the student information, and it kind of gets connected when it gets to the institution. The last contributor to complete and sign, then the form gets fully submitted, processed, and gets sent on to the institutions. So the FSA ID, which is what I was just talking about, it's a username and password. It takes a couple of days to fully be authenticated and for you to use. So, we're very early right now. You can go ahead and get that and make sure you save that, write that down. If you have an FSA ID, you can still use that. You can use that. I will say that I met with, at one of our accepted students days, a family, and the student, she's 18, and she had a sister there who was much older, and the mother had an FSA ID, and there was a period of time where they were slightly different, and she couldn't access it. And I mean, we got to the point that this person I had her fill out a paper FAFSA, which is really going old school, and they haven't even started processing those. But if you have it and you know what it is, hopefully that process is seamless, but you can absolutely just continue to use that FSA ID. Yeah, so you see, you usually have to wait 2 to 4 days before you can start the FAFSA, so that FSA ID is ready to go. So that's why I always suggest doing it ahead of time. It doesn't have to be right now, but somewhere in the, by September or by October 1st, so that you can then jump in and just start completing the FAFSA as soon as you're ready to. So the student needs an FSA ID. Likely no student has a spouse, but if the student did, they would need an FSA ID. And then what they're suggesting, and this is very much a change from the previous FAFSAs, a change that happened this year, was they're suggesting that every parent has an FSA ID, every parent who would be contributing to the FAFSA. The reality is that if parents are married and filed jointly, only one parent needs an FSA ID. The change is that if parents are married and they happen to be filing separately but still married, living together, both of those parents actually need their own FSA ID because the process has changed with connecting with the IRS. It used to be this data retrieval tool where you exited the FAFSA, kind of went in, you exited the FAFSA, went into the IRS site, and you kind of brought information back with you. But now it's a direct data exchange where you have to grant access for the IRS information to come in, and so it is person-specific, in that way. This is also a change if a parent, right, the student has to be a U.S. citizen, and so they have to have a Social Security number. But if a parent is not and they don't have a Social Security number, it used to be in the old world that they would just list zeros when completing the FAFSA and kind of push through, and they could sign a paper, a paper form. And that no longer exists, so any parent contributor who doesn't have a Social Security number now has to go through the process of getting an FSA ID. They answer kind of knowledge-based questions pulled from credit history in order to get that. If that doesn't work, it goes to a secondary process. So that has not been seamless, I will say. I think a lot of the issues have gotten resolved, and hopefully with next year that gets even better for those folks. So what's reported on the FAFSA? Student citizenship status. As I noted, students have to be U.S. citizen or eligible non-citizen to receive federal financial aid, but undocumented students or DACA students are eligible for Massachusetts in-state tuition and aid, not filling out the FAFSA, but actually filling out that Massachusetts form. The students are going to list the colleges where they are applying to. In order to submit the FAFSA, you have to have one school listed. Students can always go back in and add schools. That was troublesome this past year because once you submitted the FAFSA, students weren't able to go back in and make any corrections. And we actually still can't make corrections on the school side, but that won't be the case. You can go in once it's processed, which usually takes, a day or two. Students can go in and make updates or add schools to their FAFSA form. So who as a parent contributor is on the FAFSA? If parents are married, including same-sex parents, you're including both of those parents on the FAFSA form. All parents who live together, whether they're married or not, and they're the biological parents, both parents are on the FAFSA form. In the case of divorced or separated parents that are living separately, this is also a change. It's the parent who provided more financial support in the last 12 months and that parent's current spouse. That parent's current spouse has always been a thing, but the change was in determining it's who provided more financial support. And there's a Who's My Parent wizard that the FAFSA put into place this year, that the student answers questions to, like, who is it that I'm inviting to contribute to that FAFSA form? If parents provide equal support, then the guidance from the government is use the parent with greater income and assets. And then legal guardians are not parents. So if a student is in a legal guardianship or if a student is an orphan, ward of the court, they are not providing parent information and they're considered independent. It's going to ask about number in household. And actually, they're pulling that data directly from the tax return, right? So the kind of exemptions. And so one thing to note is that you can, it will ask if there are any updates to that household size. So an example might be parents who are divorced, and as part of their divorce agreement, you know, I claim this child this year, you claim it this year. So if the child actually was living, you know, with the parent that is the contributor on the FAFSA form, they can update that information. The last bullet point here, it will ask about number of children in college, but the kind of significant change was that's no longer a determining factor in getting down to financial aid eligibility. But what I would say is, and this is from me looking at data last year with kind of really zoning in on people who had multiple in college and what does it look like in the new formula. The new formula is more generous. The allowances are more generous. And for most people with multiple in college, I'm not seeing that great of a difference, like up to kind of 80, 100,000 in income. When you start to go over that, and incomes levels where with one in school, you likely weren't eligible for maybe need-based aid, where they were eligible, that's where I'm seeing some differences. And here's where I would say it depends as far as will an institution kind of account for that or make what's called professional judgment. As I would always say, and sometimes I say to my staff when appeals come in, you know that I'm out there saying, always ask, you know, when we have lots that come in, but ask, because the worst that they can say is, no, we can't account for that. But there may be institutions that are able to account and make some sort of adjustment for number in college. So the financial information, it's going to be for the 25-26 FAFSA. It's going to be 2023 income information that's going to be pulled from the IRS and populated into that FAFSA form and sent to schools. What has also changed is this second bullet point must give consent. Every contributor has to provide consent to pull IRS data. And if any contributor does not provide consent, the student is ineligible for financial aid. Where it gets, you know, tricky is, what about I'm a non-filer? You still have to provide consent. What if I, you know, don't file U.S. taxes and I file in a foreign country? You still have to provide consent. So that is required no matter what in order for a student to be eligible. And I definitely saw some come through where someone hadn't provided consent, and then once they were able to make corrections, they went in and did that. But that is a change from the previous time. But it's really, the tax laws are very kind of strict and security, and so that's really because of the IRS laws. It's going to include both taxed and untaxed income on the tax return. Another interesting change is that what was written into law when these changes happened, which goes back to December 27, 2020, when the changes to the FAFSA were kind of stamped into law. They didn't start working on it until much later, and it got pushed off because of the pandemic. But they can only ask income questions that come off of the tax return. So one of the things that no longer comes into play where it used to is if you, as an employee, put money into a retirement account through your paycheck, a 401k or 403b, that used to be included as untaxed income, and that no longer is considered within the formula and not considered as income because that wouldn't be coming off the tax return. That comes off a W-2, and that doesn't come through on the IRS. So parent and student assets, so include the value of any savings, checking, investments, all business, farm, and other property. So a parent's primary residence is not included as an asset, but let's say you live in a 3-family and you're renting out, 2 of those. You should be including the value of like 2/3 of that house, or you have rental properties or a summer, home or something like that. That would be included as an asset, but the primary home is not included. 529 account, so let's say you have a college savings account, a 529 account. You include that and you put that as a parent asset, which actually is better because parent assets are assessed at about 5%, where student assets are about 20% kind of going into the formula. And a change, it used to be that if you had multiple children and multiple 529 accounts, you were having to report all of them. Now you're only reporting the value of that child's 529 account. As I said, you don't include the primary home, you don't include the value of any retirement account you have, and you don't report the value of life insurance. And then, because they could only ask income questions that came off the tax return, child support is now you report as an asset, which it's an income-driven formula, so there's a benefit there at having it be reported as an asset. And then there's no debt reported, except when you're reporting the value of, say, a second home, right? You're accounting for any debt against that, so it's the net value, but just to give you a kind of a quick sense, the actual formula has your income, taxed, untaxed, and then there are allowances against that income for the taxes you pay. There's an allowance. The largest allowance is called an income protection allowance, and it's based on family size, and so there are allowances that kind of bring income down, and then assets come in, but they get a little bit watered down. It really is an income-driven formula, and then it gets down to kind of a final number, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But first, there's another form out there called the CSS profile. CSS is College Scholarship Service. They do the SATs. As well as AP, and so they have something called a profile form. About 240, 250 institutions and scholarship agencies use this form. So not every student is going to need to complete this form. What I will note is that this form asks for a whole lot more information. It uses the same base year of 2023, but it's going to ask about 24, and it's going to ask an estimate of 25. It's also very different in that, in a divorced and separated parent situation, they would say the custodial parent, right, is completing that profile form, but the non-custodial parent has to complete one as well, a separate form, and that never crosses those two families. Those two parents never see that information. It all kind of gets hooked up and sent to the institutions, but it's just a lot more information. And schools can kind of tack on additional questions. We used to use this when I worked at Harvard. Typically schools that maybe have more in funding available of their own institutional funds, they're using that form to help determine what they're providing for their own institutional funds. I can give an example of why an institution might use that. I can think about examples where a family has a negative AGI. There's income there, but it's a negative AGI, and on the FAFSA form, that really is driving income, and it's really negative, and they're kind of look the same, right, on that FAFSA form as someone who is on welfare and barely making it, right, to live. So those are some scenarios where an institution might want to be utilizing a form to kind of get at a little bit more of what really is this family's financial strength. There is a cost, and that's also different with the profile form, although if a student is eligible for like an SAT fee waiver, they're likely eligible for a fee waiver with the profile. So fee waivers, you can see about 100K or less in family income and meeting a couple of other criteria. Otherwise, it's $25 for the first school and $16 for each additional school. Some universities will just collect this in the first year, just to kind of get a baseline information, and then you're not having to fill it out. Some institutions will have you fill it out every year. So again, really suggesting that in the process of researching and then really determining where the student is going to apply, make sure you know what forms are required. At Simmons, when I first got here, we had an institutional form and the FAFSA form. I got rid of the institutional form, but when I was at Harvard, profile FAFSA, we require tax returns, business tax returns, a business farm supplement, so it can vary. So you're just going to want to know that information. The MIFA does what to know about the CSS profile webinar. MIFA provides a lot of webinars, which is really nice that you can kind of just sit in the comfort of your own home and watch that and re-watch that. And it's experts, you know, like myself who work with those forms, who go through and kind of walk through that. I don't suggest sitting through that now. Wait to see, is that a form you're going to need to fill out? And I would really wait until the point that you're about to be filling that form out. So that also opens on October 1st. And then this, you know, college financial aid application, you know, I've gotten to the point where it's like, I don't know that there's many left that have their own application. But again, really important to know if a school does. We did see last year a few schools, because of the delay, who created their own forms. Now, was it a 1 year only? Are they going to decide maybe they're going to use that with a certain population? I don't know, but just something to look out for. After you apply, the colleges and the state are going to receive the information electronically. Usually we're going to get that information within 2 days of filing. The student will receive what's called a FAFSA submission summary. It's just a listing of everything that was on the FAFSA form, as well as providing additional information. Let's say the Social Security Department wasn't able to verify the student was a U.S. citizen. It would be noted on there, and that you have to follow up with the school with documentation. Or perhaps the student was selected for verification, the student's family. I was really hoping, because everyone's required to grant access, and we're pulling information through the IRS directly, that there would be no more verification, because it would be verifying tax information and verifying household size and number in college, and number in college isn't being used anymore. So I was like, great. But the government has said, oh, no, it's still going to exist. It's just going to look different. With all the issues, they basically haven't selected many students, so they're giving a little bit of a pass this year. I still can't imagine what that verification is going to look like. There is some verification that is identity and statement of purpose, and I will say that I have a good friend who is the director at Bunker Hill, and one of the things that she's really been wrestling with is significant fraud. And people completing FAFSAs that are looking like real students, and she's uncovered a couple of fraud rings. So that identity and statement of purpose actually is really important so that we can ensure that funds, you know, are actually getting to students who need to use those funds. We're going to review information and send a financial aid offer. Some institutions may send it along with the admission letter. Some may send it after the fact. It all depends on that institution and kind of how they work. But, you know, you can always call and ask, you know, hey, I haven't, let's say the student received an admission letter, they hadn't received financial aid. Hey, what's the process? Anyone at the school will be happy to kind of answer that and walk the student through that. I talked about verification. This is really just about the financial aid office. Questions that you can ask, you know, what does this look like as far as year 2, year 3? I have always said, and I hope that most other institutions say the same thing, as long as income, assets, and household size stays about the same, you should see a very similar package, right, if it's a need-based package. Merit scholarships have their own criteria in order to retain. One thing, you know, is asking, what happens if I lose that merit scholarship, right? So at my institution, if a student receives a merit scholarship, it comes through over to my side, and I'm assessing what is the student eligible for based on need. That merit scholarship is, you know, is already covering part of that need. Now, if a student loses that, right, and they still have the same level of need, I'm increasing my need-based Simmons grant, right, to help cover that. But that could be a question that is asked. What happens if, right? How will private scholarships affect my financial aid? I'll talk about that when we look at the sample financial aid awards. What about changes in family circumstances? So 25, 26 is going to be 23 tax information. And so when you're completing that in October, we're already, you know, a significant chunk into 2024. And that could look very different than what 23 looked like. So asking, we have the ability to use something called professional judgment, which is, you know, we can change certain data elements on the FAFSA form. So we could use a 24 tax return and base it on that if there have been changes, or perhaps, you know, God forbid, there's some sort of significant medical expenses that were incurred. A school could possibly use that to make an adjustment to the FAFSA, to AGI, and increase financial aid eligibility. And then I don't know why they put how to contact the financial aid office, because that seems pretty standard. Phone call, email, maybe chat is offered, but that's certainly not at every institution. Are there any questions before I go on to how financial aid decisions are made? Okay. Yeah. Yeah, and so because that's not coming off the tax return, it's not going to be included as that untaxed income. Now, the plot twist to all of that is if a school requires the profile, you're going to be reporting retirement, you're going to be reporting even retirement value. Whether they use it is another thing. So not every institution is going to use that information, but they're going to ask about a lot more kind of income questions and asset questions on that profile form. But you can always ask, like, how is this used, right? When I worked at Harvard, you know, in the profile form, it's a default question asking about home value. We didn't use that at all. I know other institutions that use it, but it's a percent of home value, so it's not the full amount. So that's something that you can certainly ask that. So it's a very basic formula to determine eligibility, and it starts with the cost of attendance. And the cost of attendance includes both the billed or direct costs, tuition fees, room and board if living on campus. And then it always also includes estimates for non-direct or unbilled expenses. Books, supplies, personal, travel, that sort of, those categories. These are simply estimates, and it does two things, right? It gives you a sense of, oh yeah, there's other costs that we might be paying other than that bill that we're going to receive. But it's the top of the formula, so it's also increasing the student's financial aid eligibility by including those costs. The student aid index, in the old world of the FAFSA, if you've filled it out previously, it was called the EFC, the expected family contribution. They've changed the wording to call it a student aid index, which actually is a better descriptor of what it is. It's really the output of that FAFSA form, that data point that then is used to determine eligibility by subtracting this SAI from the cost of attendance. So it's a number. It's a number that helps represent a family's financial strength. It's the same federal formula that's used for every family. As I noted, income weighs more heavily than assets. And it's not necessarily what the family will pay. One of the other, and I thought it was on this slide, one of the other changes is the EFC could never go below 0, but an SAI can go down to negative 1,500. And so that's also very different. There is a calculator that you can use on MIFA.org if you wanted to know what that is, because the formula is taking the cost of attendance of a school, subtracting the student aid index, and then that determines a student's financial aid eligibility. Now let me roll back to like slide 2, talking about loans. If there's a positive number here on financial aid eligibility, and then you subtract any grants and scholarships, and there's still a positive number, that's when a student is eligible for the subsidized loan and for work study. So that's how that plays out there. And then the note is that even though an SAI can go to a negative number, within the formula it's treated as 0, and that's because there has been a long-standing rule at the Department of Education that a student cannot have funding that exceeds the cost of attendance. And if there was a negative in the formula, you could potentially have funding that exceeds that cost of attendance. So they said, no, that'll be treated as 0 within the formula. So here we're going to look at a college that has a cost of attendance of $45,000, and then their SAI is $5,000, so their eligibility or need is $40,000. They have been awarded a grant of $17,500, a scholarship of $10,000. The student loans, that's the maximum a first-year student can borrow, the $5,500. They've been allotted some work study. And if you add all of that up, right? It doesn't equal the 40,000, so there's this kind of unmet need of $5,000, right, to get to that $45,000 cost of attendance. Now, what I do want to point out is a couple of things. One, the question about outside scholarships and is it worth the work. The student really is set on a particular institution, and maybe there's that some unmet need, and they really work hard and get a bunch of outside scholarships that can go towards helping reduce that unmet need cost. Additionally, when you look at cost of attendance and aid, I know because the government has really tried to push, we should be providing to families what is net cost. And net cost they define as the cost of attendance, so all of those estimates and the actual direct costs, minus just grants and scholarships. And yes, I think that's, you know, important to think about, but what gets really confusing is that's not what you're paying toward the bill. And those estimates are not always accurate. I always talk about my, so I have a student who just finished her sophomore year, and then I have a child who just finished her senior year. So I was really in the thick of it with this FAFSA thing this past year. But my oldest, she's at Simmons with me. The other one will never want to go there, and so she's going to a different school. But my oldest, her first semester, she called me and said, Aiden, who's her boyfriend, found all of my books online. I don't have to pay anything. And then her second semester, I think all she paid was like $100. Now, we put in a year in our budget estimate of $1,280 for books. So just know that those estimates, it doesn't necessarily mean that's what you're going to be spending for those costs. But it's also, it is good to know that, yes, there are these other costs that you know, are part of going to college. Yeah. No, there's not a maximum. And that's where, you know, I kind of say, it depends, right? It depends on the college and what sort of funding they have available to help with a student. So that's where I kind of feel like having this presentation at this point as students are looking at schools, and I'll talk about how you can get a sense of what a package will look like before you've ever applied, right? And looking at that financial fit, right? So often, right, the fun part is, you know, doing these tours and looking at the schools, but financial fit is just as important, in my opinion, right, as academic fit and kind of personal fit, right? And that's very different for every family. And that's in my, one thing that I kind of go off script here that I will always say is, you know, have a conversation as a family around what does this look like financial fit for our family and what's reasonable. Because I've seen where someone hasn't had that conversation and they're, you know, have now gotten a bill and can't pay the bill and can't get a loan, but they don't want to disappoint their child. And that's so much harder. And it's also so much harder to have that conversation in the kind of excitement and scariness and all of that April, May decision time. So if you can have those conversations a little earlier, that's my suggestion, is to do that. So net price calculator, so every single institution is required to have on their website a net price calculator. And this will give you a sense of what someone who, you know, is a first-year student, right, currently, what they received as financial aid, and it's based on you inputting financial information, your own financial information. And if the institution utilizes merit scholarships, they may also ask some kind of academic questions and try to give an estimate of maybe a merit scholarship. That's not necessarily at every institution, but some may do that. So that helps give a sense of, okay, what does someone like, you know, myself or my child, what did they receive who kind of looks very similar to our kind of financial profile. And so that can be a useful tool. Now, there's not a standard net price calculator, so some may take longer than others to fill out. But I know with our own, it's probably, you know, maybe 8 minutes, maybe 10 minutes to kind of complete that, that fully and get that information. So this slide just shows how, you know, kind of somewhat to your point, you know, is there a math, but that things can look very different based on the school. So here, for the ease of kind of comparing apples to apples, right, the cost of attendance is the same, the SAI is the same, the total eligibility for all of these schools. But obviously, we have College A, right, that is providing, you know, a significant amount in grants and scholarships. And then we have College C that, you know, is much less, right? And that really is going to come down to what does that institution have as far as institutional dollars to be able to provide. And it may be that, you know, they just don't have as much and they have to try and stretch it across, you know, as equitably as possible across the population. In this example, that's the only difference. What I also would suggest, and when I've sat down with students or parents who are looking at multiple offers, so I do a lot of kind of obviously volunteer stuff, I always look at tuition, fees, room and board, and then subtracting off grants and scholarship first, and then, you know, if you're going to use loans, that, and compare these institutions that way, because those indirect expenses, books, supplies, travel, for the most part, you may see different numbers because we as colleges don't talk to each other and say, oh, what are you using for books? I'm going to use the same. So you'll see differences there, but it's going to be mostly the same at institutions, right? Unless you're flying across the country, right? And there's that flight that gets added in. But that's a really great way to be able to kind of compare those, because you may see an institution that, oh my gosh, they're giving us much more in a grant. Well, how much more is their tuition? Like looking at that as well. And you know, it also the reality that, you know, I feel like I was talking with someone recently who was comparing between one of the state institutions and then a private institution that was giving them more, and like their assumption was, oh, they thought that it would be cheaper at, you know, the state institution, but for them and their financial situation, it actually ended up being cheaper, you know, at a private institution. So it's kind of like you can't, there's no total assumptions that can be made. This particular slide drives me bonkers when I have seen letters from other institutions where they include a parent loan in there. And what I really just point out here is just don't look at the bottom line, because all of these institutions look the same. But we have College C that is giving no grant and scholarship aid, and they're basically stuffing in, you know, this very large parent loan and saying, hey, that's kind of the way to cover it. I don't appreciate when institutions do that, because this is that actually a parent has to apply for that in order to get, you know, funding if they want to utilize that funding. Okay, we're getting near the end. I know it's been a lot of information, and I appreciate everyone's patience. Any questions before I go on to this slide about kind of paying for college? And it's just a couple of slides left, I promise. Yeah.
So when you say businesses or parents,
Yeah.
is it like any type of business before?
Yeah, so it used to be Well, I could go far back, right? Like 25 years ago, everything was included. Then they made a change and they said, if a family owns a small business defined as, at least 50% owned by the parent and 100 or fewer employees, it was excluded. Now, beginning with this 24-25 year, everything's back on the table. So any sort of business, whether it's a Schedule C or an S Corp, it's any business that the family owns would be included. Value, yeah. And again, I've in my 27 years, I've seen all kinds of things, right? So if there are special circumstances or something that, the FAFSA isn't going to capture, right, something that has happened or, any kind of special circumstances. You can always talk to the financial aid office. Are they always going to be able to do something? No, but you can ask and see what, might be available as an option. All right, so this is then thinking about the point of actually paying the bill. And, really just, it doesn't have to come out of one particular bucket. So perhaps it's coming from past income or savings. I did a presentation this year at my daughter's high school, and her best friend was sitting right there. And I said, oh, perhaps your child has been working and saving rather than, spending all their money at Starbucks, because my daughter just spends the money, and I keep trying to. So she outed me to the, as soon as I'm leaving the presentation, why did you out me in this presentation? But, thinking about that student saving, maybe the student has been saving some, maybe parents have some savings, and so that's kind of coming out of the saving bucket. Present income, current wages, most all institutions have payment plans available so that rather than just paying in the fall and once in the spring for those semesters, that you can kind of stretch the payments over 4 or 5 months in each semester. Typically there's, a fee that might be anywhere from say $35 to $50 to enroll in a payment plan. And oftentimes you can actually customize it too. Hey, I know that I have a scholarship coming in. I know that I'm going to put X from some savings, and then what? I think this remaining I want to put in a payment plan, and you can do that as well. And perhaps some is coming from future income, so an additional loan that might be a parent loan or a private loan as well. So these are the kind of important conversations to have. What is each school's net price? Having that as part, as I said, of the conversation of, what is this academic fit, and how do I feel on campus? Because I know that also very much plays into things. But what is that financial fit as well? Hey, could starting at community college save money? There are, this past year there was also a push towards free community college. Students have to be actually 25 or older in order to be eligible for that currently. But there has been, in the last maybe month or so, another thing coming up where they're trying to push for that for younger students as well. Even still, at the community college level, there is the mass transfer where the credits that you get through the community college can transfer to one of the public institutions to go towards your 4-year degree. And if a certain GPA is met, there's dollars that go along with that. The one thing I would note on that is I know some people who have navigated through that, and you really got to be kind of right on it from the beginning and make sure the students working with advising and working through what their plans are if they're looking to get onto that 4-year degree. Thinking about the number of children that you're sending to school, and thinking, so often I've seen someone trying to just make that 1 year work, right? Where, you know, it's 4 years, you know, maybe it's 2 years, 4 years. Grad school, as I say, you're on your own for grad school. That's my own children. But, you know, thinking and looking at and knowing about the down the road and, you know, looking at potential starting salary as well. Massachusetts State, I've already kind of really gone over this. They have this new MASFA form, and again, this only needs to be completed if a student is not a U.S. citizen or eligible non-citizen, but has been in the state and has completed at least 3 years at a Massachusetts high school. They could complete that form. But for the Massachusetts state grant funding, it's just completing the FAFSA form for a U.S. citizen or eligible non-citizen, and that data goes to the state, and they're determined for what they might be eligible for. This is what I was talking about, the mass transfer, the kind of connection of community college to the four-year public, and then also if the tuition break, a reduction on costs for certain programs at New England schools. So you can kind of look into that through that link there. There's actually some schools that just provide like a New England rate. I know, I think it was University of Maine was one my daughter was looking at, and there was various rates, not just in-state and out-of-state, but they had a New England rate as well. So resources, here in the state of Massachusetts, we have some wonderful resources. FAFSA Day it has been something that has been a long-standing tradition. It used to really be pre-pandemic. We would have sites that might be a high school or a college, and we would sit in the computer labs, and people would come in, and we'd help them in completing the FAFSA. We really transitioned to Zoom, and it still gives the one-on-one because we put people in breakout rooms so that you can. If you have a question or you're having a challenge or whatever it might be, I can remember one FAFSA day that I was working in Wakefield, and someone came in and just had one question, and they were just uncertain about it, and came in and answer that question for them, and they were just elated. And sometimes it's just knowing that there's someone there that you might be able to ask a question. So those, and in fact, this year we've extended those events, and we actually even have more coming up. But that's a great resource. The Massachusetts Educational Opportunity Centers, there's a couple of sites, I think one out in Worcester, one in the Boston Public Library, where there's free financial aid help. MIFA Pathway is kind of a no-cost college and career planning. That's grades 6 through 12 that can be utilized. Now, do I usually send this presentation, Joe, to you to post, or should people take a picture of this timeline for senior year? Yeah, I can certainly send it. But if you guys want to take a picture of that, because you're right here at the spring, summer of junior year. You can already check off in the fall of senior year, attend MIFA's Financial Aid 101 webinar, or maybe you want to attend it again. But I will also note that on MIFA's site, under videos, there are pre-recorded Financial Aid 101 videos. In the fall, they'll do live ones as well. But if you wanted to go back, the nice with the pre-recorded is like, all right, I don't need to hear that section. Let me move on, and you already know because you've been through one. And MIFA also offers, in the spring of senior year, which is helpful, kind of understanding offers and paying the college bill. So when you're going through these Financial Aid 101 presentations, you don't have anything in front of you, right? You don't have a tangible financial aid offer. But they do those presentations where you probably have things in front of you, and so there could have been things that you think, oh, what was it that Amy said? What was that presentation? They'll hit on those things, and you'll have something in front of you and can ask questions as well. So you can get your FSA ID now or anytime, through this summer. doing the research, other webinars, I mean, honestly, I think this for junior year is good. I would suggest waiting probably until the, in the fall for any of the other webinars. But you know, I'm not going to stop anyone from watching a webinar, so you can certainly check that out. And you can sign up for MIFA emails. I've done that before myself years ago. I always want to make sure if I'm going to tell other people to sign up for things, I'm not having them sign up for getting a bunch of junk information. It was always just timely information, reminders, and you can even re-sign up, right, as a student's going into their sophomore year, so you get those reminders in your email. So any lingering questions? Yeah. Yeah, so the question was that her child is taking some courses now that would go for college credit. So it could be AP courses or it could be dual enrollment courses. You have to speak with each institution themselves and go through like a transfer credit process and evaluation of how those classes then will basically cover so that the student doesn't have to take a particular class or two. You know, usually it's some of the general education, you know, credits. So that's how that will play out. So it depends on the institution. So I can give an example of at my institution, like let's say you had one class that was coming in. That would waive that requirement, but we charge a flat rate tuition for full time, and that would be anywhere from 12 to 18 credits. So if, you know, likely the student, because typically I'm thinking of a student, they're typically in 16 credits, typically, right? So one class might be 4 credits, they're still going to be full time, so there's really no difference there. I have also seen students come in and have knocked out, and maybe they're graduating early because some of those credits that came in. So it depends on the school and the amount of credits that are transferring, and it really is school specific and just speaking through admission, and it might get bumped to the registrar's office. Yeah, yeah.
So earlier when you were talking about paying for college, don't you usually use a 529? Is that just
Yeah, so that'd be kind of like savings, right? And so if you have a 529 account, you would just reach out to them and find out what their process is. Sometimes there's online process. I like to call. That's what I've been doing with my child, and you know, and I say the amount that I want to withdraw and where to send it. Typically, there's information on the kind of billing section of a website of an institution to tell you if it's a PO box or exactly where to send a check. One thing I will note, if you have a Fidelity 529, is I feel like there have been times where I'm like, how long does it take this check to get to the institution? So I would suggest, you know, as soon as you get that bill, if you're going to withdraw some funds, you know, do that as quickly as possible so that it gets to the bill before any deadline. Yeah. Oh, he had a question. Sorry, and then you. Yeah. No, so student assets, whatever those assets are, usually it ends up being about 20% kind of roll up into what gets calculated as the SAI. Yeah, and it's about 5% on parent assets. It's not that they're expected to put 20% in. It's each year in using the information that's on the FAFSA form and what those assets are. That's just kind of a broad, you know, answer to it's about 20% of student assets that come out and go into that SAI in calculating students' eligibility. Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a number of kind of accelerated programs, let's call it so, where a student gets admitted as, coming as a first-year student, and the program actually extends right through to graduate school. And typically with those programs, one thing I would note is you get accepted into that, but there's usually a point, it might be junior year, where you have to also have met a certain set of criteria through those 3 years to really continue on into the grad program. How does that work with financial aid is a great question. We have a 3+3 program, and students' undergraduate merit scholarships actually extend through the graduate program. That's not the case at every institution, so that's something that you would want to add to your kind of checklist of, oh, how does the financial aid work in those graduate years? Yeah, and I will also note, because it's crazy, the 3+3, we have a 3+3, but it really is a 4+2 because they are undergraduates for the 4 years, and they have their undergraduate full aid for the 4 years, but their 4th year, they're fully doing grad classes, but because it's a certain number of credits in order to get your undergraduate degree, those are counting dually for both. It's wacky to remember, because when I first got here, I'm like, oh, I thought this was a 3+3. No, you are. It's just that, it's just that the student doesn't get their actual bachelor's until after the end of the 4th year. Now, maybe that's different at whatever institution she might be looking at, but yeah. Is there another question? Okay, well, I think it hasn't started raining yet, so I know that was coming tonight. But thank you for being here, and I will turn the microphone off and kind of stay up here if there's any other questions you didn't want to ask in front of everyone.